So today we're going to finish Mingo's Mischief and Tales of Friendship by Chitra Soundar. There's two short stories left, and today we're going to start with What's Fair. It was a busy morning for Suku. He had agreed to help out in the field before going to his classes with Prince Vera. Suku's cousins and some neighbors were working alongside him. Everyone usually joked and laughed as they worked. Sometimes they sang, too. But this morning, they were talking about the guard who stood outside the king's court. Suku inched closer to listen. "He will take half of everything you would get," said one woman. "Really? Does the king know?" asked the other. "No one dares to complain about the king's guard to the king," said the first woman. "How do you know it's true?" asked the second. "My brother went to see the king and was given 10 silver pieces to build a new hut," said the first woman. The guard took 5 of those. My brother has hardly anything left to finish the hut now." "That's terrible," said the second woman. Suku agreed. It was terrible. How could a king's guard be dishonest and corrupt? He had to tell Vera at once. That day, after classes, as they munched on spicy puffed rice, Suku told Vera about the conversation he had overheard. Vera, too, was upset. It was his father's court, after all. He had to do something about it. "That's the new guard," said Vera. "He was appointed only a few days ago." "New or old," said Suku, he's not supposed to take anything from the people." "Maybe we should tell father," said Vera. "We've no proof," said Suku. "Then what should we do?" asked Vera. "We need to put this right." "Maybe we should catch him red-handed." Suku paused and thought for a moment. "I've got a plan." Vera listened as Suku outlined his idea. "That might work," said Vera. "Let's hope father doesn't give the game away." Vera quickly changed out of his expensive clothes and put on ordinary ones. He did this often when he and Suku visited markets in the village square. This time, they were going to the royal court, pretending to be poor. At the entrance, there was a line. They watched the guard as he talked to each person before they entered the big hall where the court was held. "Do you think he's discussing his share?" asked Vera. "Maybe," said Suku, "or talking about the weather." Vera chuckled. "For his sake, let's hope it is the weather." The line moved slowly. Finally, it was Vera's turn. "What do you want?" asked the guard. As he was new, he hadn't recognized the prince, and he didn't know Suku. "We've come to see the king regarding a job," said Suku. "If you want me to let you in," said the guard, "you must promise to give me half of what the king gives you." "But," said Vera, "that's unfair." "Standing here all day is unfair," said the guard. "You give me my share, or I won't let you in." "Please let us in," said Suku. "We promise to give you half of everything we get." "Clever boy," said the guard as he opened the door. King Behemoth sat up in his throne in surprise when he saw Vera and Suku enter. But he didn't say anything. Vera always had a reason for doing the things he did. "State your case," said the usher. "Your Majesty," said Vera, "we want to learn horseback riding and become soldiers, but we cannot afford to pay for riding lessons." "Vera can ride like the wind, and so can Suku," thought the king. "What are the boys playing at?" "We want to train in your stables, Your Majesty," said Suku. You want to train at the royal stables?" asked the king, playing along. "My stable is not a free school." "But we don't have any money," said Vera, "and no one else would teach us." "Nothing comes for free," said the king. "If you want to train in the stables, first you have to prove worthy of it." "We'll do anything, Your Majesty," said Suku. "You must work hard collecting the dung and cleaning the stables," said the king. "Then I'll let you train with my men." "That's so kind of you, Your Majesty," said Vera. "There's just one more request." "What's that?" asked the king. This was getting stranger by the minute. "You have to let your guard come with us, too," said Vera. "Why?" "We promised to give him half of everything we got, Your Highness," said Suku. "Why would you do that?" asked the king. "If we didn't promise him half of what we got from you," said Vera, "the guard wouldn't let us in, Your Majesty." "Summon the guard," shouted Royal Behemoth to his minister. "How dare someone demand a bribe for letting people into the court?" The guard was brought before the king. "Thank you, Vera and Suku," said the king. "You've indeed saved me from disgrace." The court cheered for the boys, crying, "Long live Prince Vira! Long live Suku!" The guard realized his greed had landed him in big trouble. The king decreed that the guard would be sent to work in the stables. Stripped of his stripped of his guard duty and all of his ill-gotten wealth, the guard would have to collect horse dung for a long time. "It's good of you to take the farm gossip seriously," said Suku. Vera shrugged. "Listening to what everyone says is a part of the job," he said. "But now I want to play in the streets with you." Suku was the king of street games, especially Gilly Danda, the game of stick and stone. The boys set out to play near Suku's house. They rode their horses through the market square and past the village temple. As always, Vera's guards followed him at a discreet distance. "Wait!" called out Suku. "What?" "Someone is sleeping on the temple steps," said Suku. "He must be waiting for the temple to open," said Vera. "I want to check," said Suku. "Maybe he's hungry or lost." Vera followed him. The man had a tattered shawl draped over him and a dirty yellow cloth bag under his head. "I think he's homeless," said Suku. But Vera hesitated. "I thought we provided homes to all homeless people." "Perhaps he has come from another town looking for work." "Wake him up," said Vera. "Let's get him to a chulturi. All travelers get food and shelter there, don't they?" The guards woke up the sleeping man. As soon as he opened his eyes and saw the guards, he tried to bolt. "Don't be afraid," said Prince Vera. "We mean no harm. We just want to help." "No one can help me," said the man, covering his face with a towel. "Please let me go." Prince Vera gestured to his guards to wait on the street. "Now that it's just the two of us boys," said Suku, "tell us why you're sleeping on the temple steps." "My name is Kalu," said the man. "I've been running from one place to another ever since I escaped." "Escaped from where?" asked Vera. "From Shitalpur," said Kalu. "From King Athi's men." "Why?" asked Suku. "Did you commit any crime?" "My crime was my tickly nose," said Kalu. "All I did was sneeze at the wrong time." Prince Vera was intrigued. What was this man's problem? How could a sneeze incur the wrath of King Athi? Suku signaled to Vera to step aside. "If he's running away from a royal punishment," said Suku, "your duty is to return him to King Athi of Shitalpar." "But King Athi could invade your kingdom if you give shelter to one of his prisoners," said Suku. "But Vera, this is not Gilidanda," warned Suku. "You have to follow the royal charters of all the kingdoms around you, otherwise you'll put your own kingdom in danger." But Vera wanted to find out more. How could sneezing be a crime? "My dear Kalu," said Vera, "tell us what happened." "I worked for King Athi, looking after his royal attire and his chambers," explained Kalu. "We were all invited to his wedding." "Did you steal anything?" asked Suku. "Of course not," said Kalu. "I did the one thing that King Athi couldn't forgive." "Did you eat his wedding cake?" Kalu smiled sadly. "Maybe even that would not have caused my troubles," he said. "I sneezed just at the moment King Athi tied the sacred knot of marriage." "What?" Suku gasped. "That was so inauspicious. Inauspicious. Inauspicious here means really unlucky. It was very unlucky that Kalu sneezed right when King Athi tied the knot of marriage. "Of course it was," said Kalu. "At least for me. King Athi thought it signaled an unhappy marriage and ordered his men to put me to death." Vera bristled with anger. "No one should be put to death for sneezing," he said. "That's not fair." "Didn't anyone try to help you?" asked Suku. He felt the same way as Vera now that he had heard the man's story. How could they send him back to King Athi, who had been so rash and selfish? "The new queen intervened," said Kalu. "She begged for mercy." "Did that work?" asked Vera. "A little," said Kalu. "The king allowed me to choose how I wanted to die. But die I must," he said. "That's terrible," said Vera. "I escaped from the wedding hall," said Kalu, "and I've been running ever since." "Maybe King Athi would have cooled down by now?" asked Suku. No chance of that, said the man, showing a parchment with his name and a reward for catching him written on it. Suku and Vera sat down on the temple steps. They had to send the man back to Shitofar, but they didn't want him to be put to death either. Was there another way? Maybe he should choose poison, said Suku. That would be quick. You're not helping, said Vera. Maybe he should be trampled by an elephant, asked Suku. Don't be like that, said Vera. Maybe every day for a month he could read the stories you write, said Suku. That would kill him for sure. Very funny, said Vera. Maybe he could read your poems. That would kill him instantly. It hasn't killed you, said Suku. That's because I've become immune to them, said Vera. At that moment, something clicked in his head. At that moment, something clicked in his head. Maybe, began Suku. Wait a moment, said Vera. I think I've found a way to save Kalu. What's that? Asked Suku. Kalu, you could die of old age, said Vera. That would satisfy the king's decree and let you live until you are old. Kalu's eyes lit up. That was perfect. The boys had saved his life. You're a genius, said Suku. But he should stop going to weddings or sneezing, or both, until he's really old. Vera instructed the guards to take Kalu back to Shitofar. Kalu was confident of escaping King Aki's wrath and relieved to be going back home to see his family. Now it's time I beat you at Gilly-Danda, said Suku. I may beat you today, said Vera. Not a chance. Not even when you're old and wrinkled, said Suku, riding ahead. That is the end of our first story today. The last short story in Mango's Mischief and Tales of Friendship is Gray Elephants and Five Fools. Suku's aunt Chandra was a washerwoman. While she worked, she sang songs about the forests and the trees, the rivers and the bees. People in the village often stopped outside her house to listen. Like all washerwomen, she had a donkey. The donkey carried her load to and from the river and sang with her whenever it pleased. But of course, the donkey's braying was not sweet like Chandra's voice. Like any other donkey's, its braying was loud and harsh. One evening, Suku saw his Aunt Chandra in the market. Hello, Aunt Chandra, said Suku. How are you today? Same old, said Chandra. Every day I get into a fight with the potter next door. Why? Asked Suku. The potter gets upset about everything I do. You beat your clothes too loudly, he says. Your donkey brays too loudly. Your singing is horrible. But you sing beautifully, said Suku. That man must have no taste. Mark my words, nephew, said Chandra. One day that potter is going to bring lots of trouble and drop it on my doorstep. I hope that doesn't happen, said Suku. But if it does, I'll be there to help you. One day the potter was working on a vase for a rich man. It was a special order worth a lot of money. The potter had spent hours preparing the clay and setting it up on his potter's wheel. He didn't want anything to go wrong. The clay was poised on the wheel as it sat, began to spin. Slowly, the vase began to take shape in the potter's deft hands. Just when he was curving his fingers to shape the neck of the vase, he heard, hee-haw, hee-haw. The potter was so startled that he let go of the vase. Now it lay splattered on the ground in a big lump. He would have to start all over again. The potter was enraged at the donkey and at the washerwoman, who had allowed the donkey to sing. No one should encourage donkeys to sing, he mumbled. Enough is enough. I'm going to get rid of the woman and her donkey once and for all. That night he lay awake plotting an evil plan. Early the next morning, the potter stood in the line to meet King Bahima. What can I do for you? Asked the king. I have not come to ask for help, your majesty, said the potter. I have come to help you. The king was astonished. How could the man possibly help him? Was he a spy? A wise man with advice? Or an astrologer with a prediction for the forthcoming year? Do tell me, said King Bahima. I'm intrigued. I'm a potter, your majesty, said the man. I saw Airavata, the celestial elephant that belongs to Indra, the god of thunder, in my dream. I hear that's a good omen, said the king, still unsure why the man was in his court. Yes, your majesty, said the potter, but I wondered why that dream came to me. That's when I realized it wasn't for me. I don't have any elephants. The gods were sending a message to you through me. And what message would that be? Asked the king. Even though your royal elephants are tall and strong, said the potter, they are still as gray as the monsoon clouds. The king wasn't sure if the man was insane or genuinely trying to help. He decided to listen to him. After all, that's why he kept the doors to his court open. What should I do? Asked King Behemoth. I know someone who can wash your elephants and turn them as white as Aravata, said the potter. Really? Said the king. Who is that? My neighbor, the washerwoman Chandra, said the potter. She could turn even the grayest of clothes white. She would be perfect for the job. The king was amused. Who was this miracle woman who could turn his elephants from gray to white? Was the potter trying to get a job at the palace for his neighbor? Bring the washerwoman to my court tomorrow, ordered the king. When the news spread about the potter's dream and his suggestion to the king, everyone was afraid for Chandra. How could she change the color of elephants? Soon the rumors reached Chandra, too. She was worried. She had known the day would come when the potter would bring her harm. What was she going to do? Maybe Suku could help, she thought. Suku visited the king often and was friends with the prince. Maybe Suku could tell the king about the potter's ploy. Chandra went to Suku's house and explained the situation. Tell me how to get out of this, she begged. Don't worry, Aunt Chandra, said Suku. I'll come up with something. Suku didn't waste a moment. He set off to the palace to see Prince Vira. I need your help, my friend, said Suku. He told Vira about the tiff between the potter and his aunt and how it had reached the palace. I don't like this at all, said Vira. It is one thing to have a disagreement with a neighbor. Everyone does. We have seen so many cases of that, agreed Suku. He recalled the neighbors fighting about wells and water, mango pickles, and precious gems. But to bring it to the king and make him party to their feud, said Prince Vira, well, that's crossing a line. And she is my aunt, said Suku. I need to help her. I'm sure father will be fair, said Vira. We should teach the potter a lesson, though. Suku agreed. They couldn't just complain about the potter to the king. They needed a plan. Can you show me how your aunt washes clothes? Said Vira. Like everyone else, I suppose, said Suku. I have never washed my own clothes, said Vira. So show me. Suku took Vira back to his aunt's house in the village. She had bundles of dirty clothing to wash. I soaked the clothes in big pots like this, explained Chandra. Then I beat them on a stone. After that, I washed them in the river and dried them on the riverbank. Vira watched with fascination. I should learn about all the trades in my kingdom, he thought. Now, every time he put on clean clothes, he would appreciate the work that went into washing them. What if he had to wash a big blanket? Asked Vira. I would need a bigger pot, said Chandra. I would get one from the market. The potter next door has a shop there. Vira smiled. I think I know how to outwit the potter, he said, but you must do what I tell you. Then Vira explained his plan to Suku and Chandra. That night, Chandra slept peacefully. She knew the prince's idea would save her from the wrath of the king and perhaps even stop the potter from bothering her again. Early the next morning, the king summoned the washerwoman to the court. Prince Vira and Suku were there too. I order you to wash my elephants and turn them white, just like Aravata, the celestial elephant in the skies, said King Behemoth. He was sure the woman would refuse. Who could do such a task? The washerwoman didn't seem perturbed at all. She smiled at the king and said, Of course, your majesty. May I see your elephants first? The king was taken aback. Perhaps we should invite the potter, too, to come with us to the stables, said Prince Vira. After all, it was his dream. The king agreed and the potter was summoned. When he arrived, he joined the king and his entourage as they walked to the stables with Chandra, Vira, and Suku. Chandra entered the stables. She walked around the first elephant. She took out a string and measured the elephant. She touched its back and its trunk. Then she repeated the same process with the second elephant. She pursed her lips, nodded, and muttered to herself. The king watched with amusement as she considered the task. Suku and Vira were watching the potter. He looked far more afraid than the washerwoman. Finally, after a few minutes of inspection, Chandra stepped out of the stables. She looked at the king solemnly and said, I think I can wash these elephants and turn them white, your majesty. What? exclaimed the, exclaimed the king in surprise. But I need a few supplies before I can get to work. What do you need? asked Vera. I need 2 pots to soak each of these elephants in, she said. The pots need to be big and strong enough to hold the elephants overnight. The king caught on quickly. He looked at Vera and Suku, who were grinning from ear to ear. The king turned to the potter and said, Dear man, your idea was wonderful. Now I am relying on you to make the biggest, strongest pots to soak my elephants in. The potter gasped. His mouth fell open in shock. But, he stammered. Come with the pots, said the king, as soon as you can. The potter ran from the stables back to his house. He packed his bags and left the village, lest the king should send soldiers asking for the pots. Chandra left the palace happy. She had managed to thwart the potter's ploy. So tell me, boy, said the king, did the washerwoman have any help? Suku nodded and pointed at Vera. She is my aunt, your majesty, he said, and I'm grateful to Vera for helping me. I knew it, said the king. Well done. That night, the village celebrated the potter's defeat and Chandra's victory with a big feast. The guests of honor were Prince Vera and his best friend, Suku. A few days later, a poet was invited to the king's court. It was customary for visiting poets to recite some verses in honor of the king and his kingdom. The king would then reward the poet with money and perhaps even a title. The poet spent the whole morning reciting poems about the king's generosity. The king rewarded him with a lavish lunch with himself and his courtiers. In the afternoon, the poet recited poems about how the kingdom was filled with clever people. He read out many verses exalting the wisdom of not just the king and his court, but every citizen in the kingdom. Prince Vera and Suku listened to the last few verses from the balcony upstairs. The poet is very talented, said Suku. He exaggerates, said Prince Vera. He's just trying to impress father. It's not so easy to impress you, said Suku. That evening, after the poet had set off on his journey with a cart full of gifts, the king was in a good mood. I agree with the poet, said the king. Our kingdom is filled with wise men and women. We have no fools. Prince Vera nudged Suku. I told you, he whispered. The poet has given father a high horse. What horse? asked King Bahima, catching the last word in Vera's sentence. You shouldn't believe everything the poet said, father, said Vera. He used the word wise just to rhyme with nice. I'm not that naive, said the king. I sincerely believe I don't have any fools in my kingdom. What if I prove you wrong, said Vera. Suke and I will make our way through the village and find 5 fools. We'll meet you at the palace gardens in an hour. The king smiled. You're bored, I think, he said. I challenge you to find a single fool, let alone 5. Vera and Suku set off toward the village. On their way, they met a woman who was searching for something in the river. What are you looking for? asked Suku. My gold ring, said the woman. When did you lose it? asked Suku. This afternoon when I was working. Where were you working? asked Suku. In the mangrove, said the woman. Why are you looking in the river if you lost the ring in the mangrove? asked Prince Vera. You're so silly, said the woman. She had not recognized the prince. The mangrove is dark now, but the river is well lit. There's a better chance of finding the ring here. Come with me, said the prince. We'll get someone to find your ring for you tomorrow. So the woman followed the boys as they walked to the village. On their way, they met a farmer on a donkey with a bundle of firewood on his head. Dear man, said Prince Vera, walking alongside the donkey, why don't you place the firewood on the donkey's back? The man was aghast at the suggestion. Can't you see my donkey is very tired? asked the man. How can I burden it with the firewood, too? Prince Vera invited the man to join them. Suku offered to carry the firewood until they reached the palace. As the party of 4 made their way through the village, they saw a man lying on his back in the street. His hands were in the air, and he was calling out to people to help get him up. What is he doing? wondered Prince Vera. Suku placed the bundle of firewood on the ground and asked the man about his predicament. Can't you see my hands are far apart? asked the man. How can I get up without moving them? Why are you holding them apart? Asked Suku. Because that's the length of fabric my wife asked me to bring from the shops. Why are you on the ground then? Asked Prince Vera. Surely the fabric shop is not down there. I slipped on a banana peel and fell, said the man. I can't get up without moving my hands. And if I move my hands, I'll forget the measurement. Prince Vera and Suku helped the man up without holding his hands and asked that he too come with them. Our job is done here, said Vera. Let's go to the palace. But, said Suku, they had only 3 fools with them. Vera had promised the king he would find 5. Trust me, said Vera. Suku smiled. Vera must have something up his sleeve. When they reached the palace, the king was pacing in the gardens impatiently. There you are, he said. I'm sure you found no fools in my kingdom. I found 5 soon enough, your highness, said Vera. The king looked at the woman who was crying for her ring, the farmer on the donkey, and the man with his hands held far apart. Vera explained why he had brought them. There are only 3, said the king. Have you failed? You haven't counted all the fools, said Vera. In addition to the 3 I brought, you already know the other 2. The king looked puzzled. The 4th fool is me, your majesty, for going on an errand to fetch fools, said Vera. And the 5th fool is you, who got taken in by the words of the poet and believed that your kingdom could have no fools. Suku gasped. Had Vera crossed the line? He had just called the king a fool. The king was silent. The garden was quiet except for the call of birds returning home to roost. Suddenly, the king erupted into laughter, startling the 3 people that Vera had brought to the palace. You're right, as usual, my dear son, said the king. I was blinded by the praise of the poet. I had forgotten that it takes all sorts to make a kingdom. We can't all be brave, wise, and funny. Yes, your majesty, said Prince Vera. No one is wiser than you. That evening, as they walked back to the palace, Prince Vera hoped that he, too, would be as humble and wise as his father, and that his best friend, Suku, would be by his side to point out his faults without fear. That is the end of Mango's Mischief and Tales of Friendship. So this is not the first time that Vera has pointed out a mistake to his father. Why doesn't the king get upset when Vera points out his mistake? What do you think about Vera's hopes for his future? About his hope to be as wise and humble as his dad, the king?